here like right after the pandemic, and has been a pleasure to work with her at the studio. See this body of work develop and grow as she's continued working on her post-bac program up at the University of Massachusetts Dartmouth. We're very happy to see this finished body of work and sort of celebrate this culmination of all of Barbara's hard work over the past year. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Barbara.
So I'm going to stand here so you can see the screen. And can you hear me in the back? Rob, can you hear me?
Louder.
Louder? Okay. And if I, just put your thumbs up if I start getting too soft. Okay, well thank you for coming. And as Connor mentioned, this is work that I did the past 2 semesters as part of a post-baccalaureate program at UMass Dartmouth. And I wanted to start off with some thank yous. First of all, I'd like to thank my advisor through the program, Rebecca Hutchinson, who was a great, was very patient and also pushed me very hard. And I appreciate it. I feel like I grew a lot in the process. I also want to thank the entire community at District Clay Center. I really couldn't have done it without District Clay because the program was virtual. So I was doing all the glazing and firing here. And I want to thank Nicole and Connor and John in particular from the staff who, I mean, were incredibly supportive as I was making pieces that were bigger than I had ever made before, more complicated than I'd ever made before. And I think I kind of tried their patience at times, but everybody was really gracious about the whole thing. I mean, really remarkable. And then I also have the fellow potters in the community, especially, but definitely not exclusively. Audrey, I want to thank, Dan, Emily, Esther, Jadiel, Jessica, Julia, Kit, Lloyd, Nikki, and where is Sue?
Sue's hiding in the kitchen.
Okay, so Sue is not, has been, oh there you are, Sue. Super supportive as a potter and made all the food for tonight. So yay. So everyone was just great with advice and moral support and help. I mean, it was great. And finally, I do want to thank my sister Ann, husband Brian, who did an incredible amount of heavy lifting, both metaphorically and literally, to kind of help me through this process. So, one of the requirements for the program was that we develop a presentation that talks about our sources and our inspirations. And that's what I'm going to share with you tonight. So this was the presentation developed for the program. And for the year of the program, I decided I was going to work on vessels and kind of make metaphorical vessels inspired by historic examples. Next slide. And the slide after that. Thank you. So I wanted to start with these canopic jars. They were placed in a tomb almost 3,000 years ago with the stomach, intestines, lungs, and liver of the deceased, so they'd be available to the deceased in the afterlife. I find these jars fascinating, not only because they're a material expression of the spiritual beliefs of the time, but because over time, the organs were no longer removed from the mummified body, but the jars continued to be placed in the tombs. And so even empty, these vessels, they serve their symbolic purpose. Next slide. So these funerary urns from the Song dynasty are also highly symbolic, with dragons that represent the 4 directions of heaven. And then objects used for ritual are another source of symbolism and metaphor that I looked at. This tabernacle contained the relic of a saint, and it was believed that water or oil poured through the reliquary would have healing powers. Next slide. And while the smoke of burning incense is also a symbol, and a symbol of the prayers of the faithful rising to heaven. So these examples all just demonstrate how ceramics both give and have meaning, and how cultures around the world and throughout history have made, decorated, and used ceramics to not only make their way in the world, but to make sense of the world. So in dialogue with this great global tradition, I drew on traditional ceramics to create new works with personal, symbolic, or metaphorical meaning. Next one. And using highly decorative detail and personal narrative, I explored the passage of time, mortality and immortality, the corporeal and the spiritual, and my experience as a woman. For example, and a number of you have seen this, traditional incense burner was the inspiration for this vessel, which was fired with 1,000 slips of paper containing a prayer for justice. And next slide. And this is a detail of the lid, which features black-eyed Susans, a Victorian-era symbol of justice, to emphasize that message. Perfect. So I've always been interested in the universalities and differences of cultural expression. My mother grew up in Germany and moved to the United States to marry my father. And I grew up speaking German and regularly visiting family in my mother's hometown. My first trip was when I was 9 weeks old, and I stayed for 6 months, which is when this picture with my mother, my grandmother, and my great-grandmother was taken. Next one. And this strong connection has been passed along to the next generation. My son also speaks German and grew up visiting my cousins and their children in Germany. And my husband embraced the entire package, language, family, cuisine, and culture. He's a brave man when we met. So these regular trips back and forth and a life lived in 2 languages instilled in me an appreciation for the fluidity of meaning and an understanding that cultural assumptions are often just perspectives. As I navigated between 2 cultures, I became an observer and a ponderer of cultural expectations and norms. So it's probably not surprising that I ended up working at the National Museum of Natural History, next slide, which has one of the largest, actually the one after this, there we go, has one of the largest anthropology collections in the world with over 3 million cultural artifacts. Next one. And in my 30 years developing exhibitions and educational programs at the museum, I enjoyed learning about our everyday and our emotional relationships with the cultural, natural, and material world we live in. Our public programming explored the ways in which cultures and cultural expressions, while grounded in tradition, are always adapting. Culture is not static, as evidenced by this Maori artisan who was invited to participate in one of our festivals. He showed visitors how to decorate a traditional waka, or canoe, but also helped them understand that Maori artisans are incorporating new tools, materials, and symbols into their work as their culture is changing. Next slide. Working at a natural history museum also led to a deeper appreciation of the natural world, and I'm particularly drawn to the beauty and symbolism of seed pods, mushrooms, dead wood, insects, and other powerful reminders of the transience of life and the regenerative cycles of nature. The language of nature, particularly that of flowers, has been used for millennia to give meaning to ceramics, as evidenced by this vase from the Song Dynasty. It's decorated with painted chrysanthemums, which were believed to prolong life when eaten and then became a symbol of longevity. And in making this vase, I used the life cycle of poppies to reflect on the interplay of life and death. Next one. The makers of the arts and crafts and Art Nouveau movements often incorporated stylized and highly romanticized floral and feminine elements into their designs. Next slide. I appreciate the expressive quality this leads to their work, or lends to their work, and appropriated their visual language to feature the less idealized, next one, and the more intimate aspects of womanhood. Next slide. So I've long been a fan of Mark Dion's work, especially how he plays with and challenges the very idea of natural history exhibitions. His cabinets of curiosity, modeled on the earliest museums, examine how prevalent ideologies and institutions influence our understanding of history, knowledge, and the natural world. And Kara Walker is best known for her room-sized tableau of cut paper silhouettes that explore race, gender, sexuality, violence, and identity. I appreciate how she upends our expectations of scale and content to use this traditional and typically domestic craft form to challenge the way we look at and understand American history. Jordan Nasser bases his work on tatriz, a traditional Palestinian cross-stitch embroidery created in panels and pieced together to create clothing or other items. Nasser's panels feature elements of his upbringing in the Upper West Side, which he likens to the tatriz tradition in Palestine, where each village has its own symbols. Liza Liu also works in a traditionally feminine medium, beading, it's hard to believe that these are beaded, to create sculptures and paintings, in parentheses, that defy expectations for her chosen material and subject matter. So this work features sheets made up of tens of thousands of hand-sewn white glass beads that are painted and stained with color. I love how the piece becomes more exquisite and more beautiful the closer you look. So there's a long tradition of imitating, borrowing from, and adapting ancient ceramics. Bernard Palissy was a craftsman and an engineer and a naturalist, and he spent 16 years trying to find a formula for Chinese porcelain. He failed, but he did end up developing a style of ceramics that he called rustic ware that featured decorations of small creatures in relief among vegetation. Next slide. And a similar approach allowed me to present a biological perspective on the afterlife in response to the more typical spiritual symbolism found on traditional vessels. Josiah Wedgwood, a personal favorite of mine, made both his fortune and the taste of the time in his quest to imitate porcelain and elevate ceramics beyond the purely functional. Through constant experimentation and innovation, he was able to adapt Etruscan, Greek, and other classical motifs and forms for a contemporary clientele, making his wear and style a household name to this day. And I want to point out that that is a canopic vase, a canopic jar. Livia Marin is one of, representative of a number of contemporary ceramic artists who make traditional and historic ceramics their own. She uses the aesthetic of Chinaware to reflect on loss and care, disposal and preservation, and the relationship we develop with the everyday objects in our lives. And Roberto Lugo is known for pottery mashups that blend contemporary social issues with traditional ceramics. He adorns classically luxurious forms with surface design and hand-painted portraiture that reference hip-hop and highlight themes of poverty, inequality, and racial injustice. And Chris Anteman creates contemporary parodies of 18th century figurines. Since 2012, she's worked with German porcelain manufacturer Meissen to learn the artistry of porcelain casting and to adapt some of Meissen's original molds into more modern and kind of personally expressive pieces. And last but not least, Michael and Magdalena Frimkes collaborate to make whimsical interpretations of classical shapes. Michael throws forms borrowed from Greek, Chinese, and indigenous American antiquity, while Magdalena paints the pieces, often using anachronistic, kind of contemporary images like Minnie Mouse, or in this case, bike riding. Together they play with expectations and put their unique stamp on traditional forms. So this is my take on canopic jars, reimagined as tin cans and created to accompany my journey through my earthly life. What are the things I need to hold on to? What are the things that have shaped who I am today? So in making the canopic jars and these other pieces that you've seen, I hoped to both honor ancient and historical traditions and make them my own. And if in the process I was able to share my unique perspective on our relationship with the world and possibly challenge some expectations, all the better. So thank you. Thank you for coming.
Does anybody have any questions that they would like to ask Barbara about the work, about the series? Please feel free to shout out a question if you have one.
How did you find out about the program?
Great question. So Rebecca Hutchinson, who runs the program, she's a really gifted ceramic artist, and she's kind of one of the leaders in what's called paper clay. So porcelain that has clay, porcelain that has like clay that has paper mixed in with it, and it makes it just stronger and easier to work with. And so she offers workshops. I took one of her workshops. I got on her mailing list because of that, and learned about it through her that way. But I have to say, I had been looking around at possible programs because when I left the museum, I wanted something that would give me a little discipline, a little focus. And this just was perfect. I mean, because it was just a year, I knew kind of a master's would be more than I could take on, or that it made sense to take on. And this was just the perfect amount. Although it was more than I had bargained for. It's a very rigorous. It's a really rigorous program, which is great. But I hadn't quite. Anyway, it was rigorous. Yes.
Which piece or pieces did you find either the most technically challenging or personally challenging to create?
Yeah. So technically, most challenging was the Wanderer, the fallopian tube vase, so the one that I kind of loved the most, and it was also just the hardest. It was just the hardest to do, and it was. I mean, I did use. Working with Rebecca was a benefit because I did use paper clay, which helped be able to make those kind of big, swooping arms. But yeah, that was just hard. And actually, one thing that I learned in the program, because I had made much smaller stuff before, there's a whole art and science to making and glazing and firing large pieces, and I think that was a really big learning process for me.
Other questions? Yes.
Can you, sort of building on that, can you say something about the process? I knew you in the past, and we used to sit at potter's wheels, and I understand most of this is not done that way. Why did you go in that direction, and what happened, and is that how you get big?
Right. So yeah, I started off as a wheel throwing potter, and then it was actually the pandemic. So you mentioned that I started my first class at District Clay was supposed to be March 16th, 2020. And that didn't happen. But District Clay really quickly, turned around and started offering online classes. But so since I didn't have a wheel at home, I was learning how to roll clay out on my dining room table and shape it into forms. And I just fell in love with it. I just felt like it's just a whole different process. I think the way you kind of construct and think about your pieces. Yeah, I guess since then I haven't really turned back. And I will say that well, I think baking, I don't know, I've never made big things throwing, but I guess it's hard to make it real, however you make it, but some of those hand building, it was challenging.
Scale is always
Yeah.
trouble with ceramic arts for any of you who engage with it.
Yeah. But I did coil build, which is one of the I had done slab building, but I coil built for the first time in the program, and I really did learn to enjoy that, and that is a means of having enough control to get big. It just takes time.
Yes.
So, Barbara, what next? Any of these are going to inspire you to go in a different direction, or are you going to, what can we expect?
It's a great, great question, and I've been thinking about that a lot. And I think for a while I want to make some smaller things. Just things that aren't as scary to get put in the kiln, and where you're crossing your fingers and biting your lip, how they'll come out. But it's interesting, because I think that, okay, I'm going to share my analogy. It's like think of this, thinking, I could think of this as like my spring 2023 collection. Can you hear?
Yeah.
Okay. So spring 2023 collection, and there are elements in all of the things that I made that I want to kind of keep exploring. Just maybe, in some ways, maybe smaller versions, and maybe think about ways that I can kind of build faster and a little bit more efficiently. But I really did, everything that I made kind of came. I was telling somebody in this program, I was like, I didn't realize I had all this in me that I wanted to get out. So now I want to just keep exploring some of those ideas, and also some of those some of that visual language that I created.
Any other questions?
What's it like to live like the artist's life?
after having lived the office life.
Yeah.
It's really, there's some people from work here, so they're gonna, but I don't work there anymore, right? But I have to say, what is lovely, what is really, really wonderful is to just, it's really only what I want to do, right? I mean, I'm not working on a team. I don't have to get buy-in from other people. I mean, I did work with my professor, and she had some good guidance. But it really is, I feel like it's much more personal, and it's much more directed by myself. And that is also the hard part, because if something, if it's not going well, or if I'm not doing what I'm supposed to be doing, if I'm avoiding it or whatever it is, I have only myself to blame. So it's kind of two-pronged.
So I have a question. Or actually, what I'd like, not a question, I think, I'd like you to talk about like what to do with the unexpected. Because for me, as you were doing all this, it was interesting to find out that you don't quite control how it comes out of the kiln. There are all these things that can happen, like the wanderer, as it's an example.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's actually, and Connor's been helpful with this, because, I think when you come from making utilitarian pottery, a crack or the glaze that doesn't work out the way you want, I mean, it's just bad, right? It's just like the piece doesn't have any value anymore. What I've learned is that you have to kind of be open to some of these things happening, and then there's a lot more ways in which you can kind of run with what happened and make a virtue out of it, I would say, than I had realized before. So in some ways, and I think what I need to get better at, to answer Karen's question, is also working on things, knowing, like designing almost in for the unexpected. Be a little less tight.
Any other questions? Any final questions?
I have a question. So, what are your thoughts about the limitations of the materiality of working in clay? Your temple, or
Yeah, the tabernacle. Yeah.
has applied to it representations of tin icons, but you rendered them in clay. Did you find that there was anything that you just sort of wish you could have inserted a steel rod into something, or that the clay didn't answer what you wanted to accomplish? Or do you feel like you really found ways to be expressive with the clay that you were surprised by?
Yeah. Again, it's a great question, and I guess the answer is yes, and yes. I mean, there were times in the program where I thought, why on earth did I pick clay of all things to try to say these things, because I think clay does have, I don't know, I guess every medium has its constraints, but it does seem like clay sometimes seems like it's less flexible than other things would be. At the same time, I think part of it was also learning some skills You know, I mean, I didn't do it, but you know, there are ways of putting armatures into your clay. I mean, I think you can get kind of a little bit more multimedia or get creative with how you adapt or incorporate other pieces to solve problems. And the other thing I learned, I would say, is that you have to have a lot of patience. I feel like a lot of the things that were challenging, really it was, if you like have the patience to kind of prop it up and let it dry, get the clay to the right consistency. I just think that there's, you kind of learn, you almost learn the pace and the possibilities of clay. And it did feel limiting at times, but I feel like I also learned a lot of ways to stretch that.
Well, once again, thank you, Barbara. Congratulations.
Thank you.